They called it progress. Iron rails cutting through sacred ground. Steam engines drowning out the voices of the dead. I came to stop a railroad, thinking justice was simple. Then I learned the man building it was my father, and the land he was stealing had already been stolen twice. Some truths don't set you free. They bury you alive. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The Union Pacific Spur Line reached Broken Mesa Territory on a September morning when the sky burned red as fresh blood. Nathaniel Cross watched from the ridge as rail gangs hammered spikes into timber, each blow a death knell for the Kiowa families camped 3 miles west. They didn't know yet that steel and steam were coming for everything they had left. The telegram from Washington had been brutal in its brevity. Pacific Continental Railroad granted federal easement. Kiowa relocation October 1st. Armed resistance will be met with military force. 3 sentences to erase a people. 3 sentences to call theft progress. Nathaniel had spent 5 years as an Indian agent, one of the few who gave a damn whether tribes lived or died. That integrity cost him his career when he refused to certify fraudulent land surveys. Now he worked freelance, fighting battles the government preferred to ignore. The Kiowa had sent for him 6 weeks ago. White man's iron snake coming. Need help. What they could pay amounted to 3 horses and gratitude. He descended the ridge, dust catching morning light like suspended gold. The rail camp sprawled across trampled grassland, a scar of canvas tents, timber piles, and gleaming iron rails. 200 men building empire, enriching investors who'd never calloused their hands. The foreman, Garrett Stone, spotted him immediately. Bull-shouldered, sun-weathered, hand on his revolver. Private property. You're trespassing. Federal land, Nathaniel corrected, dismounting. Temporarily leased. There's a difference. Stone's eyes narrowed. Who the hell are you? Nathaniel Cross. I represent the Kiowa families your rails are approaching. Those savages got no claim. Government relocated them. Paperwork's legal. Interesting. The Kiowa I spoke with yesterday had no knowledge of any relocation order. Makes me wonder if that paperwork exists. Stone stepped closer, bulk meant to intimidate. You're interfering with progress. This railroad's going through whether those Indians move or not. Then let's talk to someone who matters. Where's Dalton? Stone gestured toward a gleaming luxury railcar, sitting incongruously amid the rough camp. Mr. Dalton's private car. But you're playing a game you can't win, Cross. The railroad always wins. The private car was a monument to wealth. Polished mahogany, brass fittings, glass windows worth more than families earned in years. Inside, at a desk surrounded by leather chairs and oil paintings, sat James Dalton, silver-haired, 50s, impeccably dressed, eyes that evaluated and found most men wanting. Mr. Cross, Garrett says you're here to cause problems. Prevent them, Nathaniel replied, remaining standing. You're running rails through land with treaty protections. Head, past tense. The Railroad Act superseded Kiowa treaties. Congress determined national progress outweighs local interests. Nathaniel pulled folded documents from his coat. Congress can't unilaterally abrogate treaties. I've filed injunctions with territorial court and alerted the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Continue without proper process. You violate federal law. Dalton leaned back, fingers steepled. You've done homework. Most Indian agents I've met were incompetent or corrupt. You're neither. I'll take that as an observation. Dalton poured brandy, offered a glass. Nathaniel declined. Smart. Keeps lines clear. Dalton tasted his drink. Do you know what a week's delay costs? $15,000. A month? $60,000. You're suggesting I negotiate with Indians who have no concept of property rights. They understand this is their home, that ancestors are buried here, that your rails cut through sacred sites used for centuries. Dalton set his glass down carefully. This railroad has presidential approval. congressional authorization, backing from investors who could buy territories. What it doesn't have is time for legal technicalities and sentimental attachments. He walked to the window. I'll offer the Kiowa $500 for relocation. Generous by any standard. $500. Nathaniel let the inadequacy speak itself. For land that's been their home for generations. For burial grounds. For hunting territory feeding families. More than they're legally entitled to, which is nothing. Land was ceded by treaty to the United States. The 1868 treaty specifically protects this territory. Broken Mesa was designated permanent Kiowa land. Your railroad violates that treaty. Something cold flickered in Dalton's eyes. The 1868 treaty was renegotiated. There's paperwork in Washington. Funny thing, my bureau friends say no such amendment exists. Makes me wonder if your renegotiated treaty is fiction. Dalton's composure cracked. You're playing a dangerous game, Cross. Men who interfere with railroad construction experience accidents, falls, misunderstandings with security, such tragedies. Is that how Pacific Continental handles legal challenges? Threats, historical observations. The frontier is dangerous for those who make powerful enemies. Nathaniel met his eyes, then observed this. Men who build empires on stolen land find foundations crumble, sometimes through courts, sometimes when the wrong decide legal remedies are insufficient. Are you threatening sabotage? Predicting consequences? There's a difference. Silence stretched taut as telegraph wire. Outside, hammers clanged against spikes, the soundtrack of progress measured in violence. Get off my property, Dalton said, voice turned to ice. Tell your Indians they have until October 1st. After that, federal troops enforce relocation. Resist, they're treated as hostiles. Interfere further, you're arrested for obstruction. I look forward to that trial. Discovery should be fascinating. Nathaniel walked out into harsh sunlight. A man in black watched from beside supply tents, railroad security, badge on vest, hand on revolver. Eyes flat with the assessment of someone who killed for wages. Nathaniel nodded. The man didn't nod back. 3 miles west, the Kiowa encampment circled beside a creek still running clear, though railroad grading was already clouding water upstream. Chief Gray Cloud waited by the council fire, with 4 elders. 60s, face lined like canyon walls, eyes that had seen too much history collapse. Iron Snake Man talk. Gray Cloud asked. He talks, doesn't listen, offers $500, says you must leave October 1st or soldiers force you. Gray Cloud translated. The elders' faces remained impassive, but tension showed in shoulders, eyes. They'd known this was coming. What does law say? Owl Wing asked. A grandmother whose runner had fetched Nathaniel 40 miles. Law says they can't take your land without proper process. But they're acting like they already have authority, creating facts that make legal challenges irrelevant. So law means nothing, Gray Cloud said flatly. Law means something if we make it. I've filed injunctions, contacted newspapers, reached out to reform politicians. But fighting through courts takes months, years. The railroad won't wait. Then what do we do? Owl Wing's voice carried grandmother's weight. You have options. None good. Leave peacefully. Accept inadequate compensation. Relocate to marginal land. Lose your home but live. He paused. Or resist. Stay. Force removal by violence. Pray resulting outrage generates political pressure to stop the railroad. It's a gamble. Might work. Might just get people killed while the railroad builds anyway. White man's choices, Gray Cloud said bitterly. Surrender or die. There might be a third option. What if we give them what they want but destroy what they're actually after? The elders leaned forward. The railroad builds here because it's the most direct route to Greystone Canyon silver mines. Shorter route means faster transportation, higher profits. But if this route becomes impossible, land too unstable, dangerous, expensive to maintain, they'd use the northern route. Takes 40 miles longer around the mesa, bypasses your land entirely. You want to destroy Iron Path. Gray Cloud asked. Make it not worth building. There's a difference. Owl Wing studied him with ancient eyes. This path walks close to war. Close to sabotage. Illegal, dangerous, would make me a fugitive. This isn't your fight. It's mine. If I take actions that benefit you, that's my decision. You maintain plausible deniability. Why risk yourself for people not your own? Stone Deer asked. A man whose grandson died of smallpox brought by white traders. It was complicated, rooted in guilt and grief and conviction that his people's expansion was less heroic destiny, more organized atrocity. But he gave simpler truth. Because someone should. Because if all who claim to care do nothing, caring means nothing. Because my country signed treaties, and I believe treaties should mean something, even when breaking them is profitable. Gray Cloud weighed trust against experience. Finally nodded. If Iron Snake can be turned, we will not stop you. But do not die for us, Nathaniel Cross. Too many have died already. Nathaniel rode out. That evening as sun descended toward mountains, painting sky and fire. Behind, Kiowa families prepared meals, children's laughter on wind. Ahead, rails gleamed in dying light, iron promises cutting toward sacred ground. Between those worlds, between people being erased and progress doing the erasing, he'd chosen his side. Now he just had to figure out how to win against an enemy with infinite resources, legal authority, and conviction that history was on their side. The first surveyor's stake he pulled that night wouldn't stop the railroad. Neither would the 10th. But every stake removed was a small resistance, declaring this land wasn't given freely. That progress measured in destruction had a price. He worked under Starlight, a ghost sabotaging empire, wondering how long before Dalton security found him, before the game became bloodier than he could stomach. Behind, Coyote howled, or wind, or the land itself, crying against iron violation. Some questions don't have answers, only consequences. The dynamite came easier than Nathaniel expected. Frontier towns like Greystone were lousy with miners, and miners met explosives. He traded 2 weeks' worth of surveying work, legitimate work, ironically, for 6 sticks wrapped in waxed paper and a coil of fuse. The miner who sold them, a grizzled Welshman named Davies, hadn't asked questions. Men who worked with explosives understood that sometimes you needed to move earth that didn't want moving. 3 days after his meeting with Dalton, Nathaniel studied the railroad's progress from his camp in the Red Rock Canyons above Broken Mesa. They'd advanced another quarter mile, rails gleaming like a serpent's spine stretching toward Kiowa land. At this rate, they'd reach the encampment boundary in 2 weeks, maybe less if Dalton pushed harder. The vulnerable point wasn't the rails themselves. Those could be replaced overnight. It was the granite cut 3 miles ahead, where Pacific Continental had spent 6 weeks blasting through solid rock to maintain their precious direct route. Collapse that cut, and they'd face months of work to clear it. Or more likely, they'd accept the northern route and leave the Kiowa alone. That was the theory anyway. The practice involved sneaking past railroad security, placing charges without triggering them prematurely, and not getting caught or killed. Simple. Nathaniel waited until the 3rd night, when clouds obscured the moon and the rail camp settled into its restless sleep. Guards still patrolled. Stone wasn't stupid, but they focused on the camp perimeter, not on terrain ahead of the advancing rails. Why would they? Who'd sabotage route they hadn't reached yet? He moved through darkness like smoke, carrying his deadly burden wrapped in burlap to muffle any sound. The granite cut loomed ahead, walls rising 30 feet on either side, the product of backbreaking labor and enough black powder to level a small town. Pacific Continental had spent a fortune creating this passage. Tonight, Nathaniel would make that investment worthless. He was placing the 3rd charge, wedging dynamite into a crack where it would do maximum structural damage, when he heard the voice behind him. Figured you'd try something like this. Nathaniel froze, slowly turned. The man in black from the rail camp stood 15 feet away, revolver drawn, badge catching faint starlight. Up close, Nathaniel could see he was younger than expected, maybe 30, with the lean hardness of someone who'd survived violent work. Name's Cole Braddock, the man said conversationally. as if they'd met at a social gathering. Railroad security. Mr. Dalton pays me to handle problems that can't be solved with lawyers or money. Problems like you. Then you should shoot. Nathaniel kept his voice level, hands visible, mind calculating distances and angles, because I'm not stopping. I know. Braddock's tone carried something unexpected, almost like respect. You got principles. Can see it in how you carry yourself. How you talk to Dalton like a man, instead of begging like most Indians' lovers do. Principles are admirable. He paused. They're also stupid. Get people killed. You gotta be the one doing the killing? If necessary. Braddock's revolver didn't waver, but I'd prefer you just walk away. Leave the charges. Leave the territory. Forget the Kiowa. Live to fight some other battle on some other day. Can't do that. Yeah, figured. Braddock sighed. You know what's going to happen, right? Even if you blow this cut, even if you delay the railroad a month, 6 months, it won't matter. Pacific Continental will rebuild. They'll hire more security. They'll get federal troops to clear the Kiowa by force. All you'll accomplish is making the process bloodier. That really what you want? What I want, Nathaniel said carefully, is for treaties to mean something, for the government to keep promises, for people to be treated like people instead of obstacles to profit. Noble. Futile but noble. Braddock lowered his revolver slightly, not enough to give an opening, but enough to signal this wasn't yet a killing moment. Let me tell you something, Cross. I've worked railroads from Kansas to California, seen tribes relocated, treaties broken, land stolen under every legal pretense you can imagine. And you know what I learned? Progress doesn't care about justice. It doesn't care about what's right. It just comes like a flood and drowns everything that doesn't move. So I should move. Let it drown them. Yeah, because the alternative is drowning with them. Nathaniel met Braddock's eyes, seeing not malice, but a weary pragmatism born of watching ideals break against reality too many times. Maybe, but at least I'll drown knowing I tried. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Braddock did something Nathaniel didn't expect. He holstered his revolver. I'm going to walk back to camp, Braddock said. Tell Stone I heard something. Investigated, found nothing. You're going to finish placing those charges, set your fuse, and be 5 miles away before dawn. And we're going to pretend this conversation never happened. Why? Because I'm tired, Braddock admitted. Tired of being the man who pulls the trigger on other men's principles. Tired of working for people like Dalton who measure progress in dollars and don't count the cost in graves. And maybe, he paused, maybe I want to see if someone with actual convictions can beat the railroad, even if I know they can't. He started to turn away, then stopped. Fair warning, though. If Dalton orders me to bring you in after this, I will. This is a one-time mercy, Cross. Professional courtesy between men who understand duty, even when we're on opposite sides. Don't mistake it for alliance. Understood. Braddock disappeared into darkness, leaving Nathaniel alone with his explosives and the sudden vertigo of unexpected mercy. For a moment, he considered the possibility this was a trap, that Braddock was fetching backup, planning to catch him red-handed with lit fuse. But instinct said otherwise. Braddock had been sincere. Conflicted but sincere. Nathaniel finished placing the charges, working with methodical precision. 6 sticks total, positioned to bring down the southern wall of the cut and send thousands of tons of granite cascading into the passage. It wouldn't completely block it. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, but it would make clearing the route a nightmare of time and expense. The fuse was 15 minutes long, plenty of time to reach safe distance. He lit it with shaking hands, not from fear, but from the weight of crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Whatever happened next, he was no longer just an advocate working within the system. He was a saboteur, a domestic terrorist, in the language Dalton's lawyers would use. A man who'd chosen direct action over legal process. The fuse sputtered to life, spark eating slowly toward destruction. Nathaniel ran. He was 200 yards away, concealed behind a boulder outcropping when the charges blew. The explosion lit the night like sudden dawn, a flash of orange and white, followed by the deep thunder of granite, surrendering to physics. The southern wall of the cut groaned, shuddered, and collapsed in a roaring avalanche of rock. Dust rose in a choking cloud, and for 30 seconds the world was nothing but sound and fury. Then silence. Ringing, profound silence. Nathaniel waited, breathing hard, watching for movement. In the rail camp below, lanterns sparked to life. Shouts carried on the night wind. Stone's voice bellowing orders. The camp mobilizing, trying to understand what had happened. And somewhere in that chaos, Cole Braddock pretending he'd heard nothing, seen nothing, knew nothing. Nathaniel slipped away into darkness, moving quickly through terrain he'd scouted obsessively. By dawn, he'd be 20 miles away, camping in a canyon where even experienced trackers would struggle to find him. He'd bought the Kiowa time. Maybe weeks, maybe months if the damage was as severe as he hoped. But Braddock had been right about one thing. This wasn't victory. It was just a delay. A tactical success that changed nothing about strategic reality. The railroad would rebuild. Dalton would bring in more security. Federal troops might get involved. And when they did, the Kiowa would face violence that would make relocation look merciful. Unless Nathaniel could find a way to make the fight too expensive, too public, too politically damaging for Pacific Continental to sustain. He needed allies, needed press coverage, needed to transform this from a local dispute into a national scandal. But first, he needed to disappear before Stone's men caught his trail. As sunrise painted the eastern sky in shades of blood and gold, Nathaniel looked back one final time at the smoke still rising from the collapsed granite cut, at the iron rails stretching toward land that wasn't freely given, at the rail camp scrambling to assess damage and assign blame. He'd hurt them. Not killed, but hurt. And he'd do it again if they kept pushing. Some men fought with words and law, some with prayers and hope. But when those weapons failed, when the enemy had infinite resources and no conscience, sometimes the only language they understood was destruction. Nathaniel Cross had always believed in the system, in reform and justice, in the slow progress of civilization toward something better. But the railroad had taught him a harder truth. Sometimes civilization was just a prettier word for conquest. And sometimes the only way to stop conquest was with method civilization condemned. He disappeared into the wilderness, a ghost sabotaging empire, and wondered how many lines he'd crossed before this was over. Wondered if there was a version of victory that didn't turn him into the very thing he was fighting. A man who measured success in destruction, who justified violence with righteous cause, who told himself the ends would somehow cleanse the means. Behind him, the railroad camp began organizing a manhunt. Ahead, the Kiowa families woke to another dawn, not knowing someone they'd hired for legal help had just committed a crime that could justify federal troops burning their lodges and killing their children. Between those two realities, Nathaniel rode, carrying weight that had nothing to do with the rifle on his back or the dynamite still in his saddlebags. The weight of choices that changed who you were, even when you swore they wouldn't. The weight of becoming dangerous because the alternative was helpless. The weight of progress measured in explosions, and justice that looked suspiciously like vengeance. The land stretched vast and indifferent around him. The sky offered no answers. And somewhere in the distance, iron rails gleamed in morning light, waiting to resume their inexorable advance. The explosion bought 3 weeks. 3 weeks while Pacific Continental assessed the damage, shipped in equipment to clear the collapse, and decided whether to continue through the granite cut or admit defeat and use the northern route. 3 weeks while Nathaniel hid in canyons and sent carefully worded letters to newspapers in Denver, Santa Fe, and San Francisco, hoping someone with a platform would care about treaties being violated and tribes being erased. Most ignored him. Progress sold better than justice. But 3 weeks was time for the Kiowa to fortify their position. Not militarily, they weren't suicidal, but legally. Nathaniel helped them draft petitions, collect testimonies from tribal elders documenting their history on this land, and send appeals to the Bureau of Indian Affairs demanding the treaty renegotiation paperwork Dalton claimed existed. It was during one of these petition drafting sessions in Gray Cloud's lodge that everything changed. that the mission Nathaniel thought he understood revealed itself as something far more complicated, far more personal, far more impossible. Owl Wing was translating testimony from an elder named Winter Fox, a woman in her 80s whose memory stretched back to when white men were rare as rain in August. She spoke in careful Kiowa, and Owl Wing rendered it into English, and Nathaniel wrote it down for the official record. She says her grandfather told stories of the time before whites came. Owl Wing translated, when this land belonged to Kiowa and sky and nothing else. Before soldiers, before treaties, before the first white man who claimed he could own what belonged to everyone and no one. Does she remember the first whites in this territory? Nathaniel asked. Winter Fox responded, her voice cracking with age but firm with memory. Owl Wing translated, she was a child, maybe 8 summers. A white man came with soldiers, but he was not a soldier. He measured land with chains and tools that looked at the sun. He made marks on paper. The soldiers said he was teaching the Kiowa how land would be divided for treaties. Nathaniel wrote quickly, trying to capture every detail. Land surveyors had been instrumental in most treaty violations. Their fraudulent measurements and convenient omissions provided legal cover for theft. Does she remember the surveyor's name? Winter Fox spoke again, and Owl Wing's translation came slowly, carefully. She doesn't remember his name, but she remembers his face. Young then, maybe 30 summers. Light hair like dry grass. Eyes that looked sad even when he smiled. He gave children sweets from his pack. Her brother took one and was sick 3 days. But Winter Fox knew it wasn't poison. Just white man's food their stomachs couldn't understand. Did the surveyor do anything unusual? Anything that suggested he might have been falsifying the survey? More conversation in Kiowa. Then Owl Wing said, Winter Fox says he argued with the soldiers. She didn't understand the words, but she understood anger. The surveyor wanted to measure one way. The soldiers wanted him to measure another way. Finally, the surveyor did what the soldiers wanted, but his face looked like he was swallowing poison. Nathaniel felt something cold settling in his chest. A surveyor who'd been coerced into fraudulent measurements 40 years ago. Light hair, sad eyes, kind to children despite being part of their dispossession. It could be anyone. Could be dozens of men who'd worked territorial surveys. But he had to ask, did Winter Fox ever learn the surveyor's name? Ever hear soldiers call him something? Winter Fox spoke at length, her ancient memory working through decades. Finally, the soldiers called him by rank and name, Lieutenant. Winter Fox spoke a word in halting English, struggling with pronunciation that didn't match Kiowa sounds. Lieutenant Dalton. The world tilted. Nathaniel's pen stopped moving. The lodge seemed suddenly airless, walls pressing in. Can you ask her? Nathaniel said, voice strange in his own ears. To describe him again? Everything she remembers? Winter Fox spoke, and Owl Wing translated. Tall, thin then, though strong enough to carry survey equipment. Light hair, almost yellow in sunlight. Eyes like sky before storm, gray and blue mixed. Scar on his left hand from some old wound. Carried himself like soldier even though he wore different uniform. And the sad eyes. Always the sad eyes, even when he laughed with children. James Dalton, younger, before silver had replaced gold in his hair, before wealth had added weight, before whatever choices he'd made had transformed sad eyes into cold calculation. But it couldn't be. The man Nathaniel had met in that luxury railcar showed no sign of conscience, no echo of someone who'd once argued with soldiers over fraudulent surveys. That man measured progress and profit and saw indigenous people as obstacles, not humans. Yet Winter Fox's description was too specific, too detailed to be coincidence. And the name, mispronounced but recognizable, sealed it. James Dalton had surveyed this land 40 years ago, had participated in the fraudulent measurements that would eventually justify stealing it. And now he was back, driving a railroad through territory he'd helped unlawfully claim for the United States. Nathaniel. Gray Cloud was watching him with concern. Your face is wrong. This memory is important. Yes, Nathaniel managed. It's evidence. evidence that the original survey was compromised. If Winter Fox testifies that the surveyor argued with soldiers before changing his measurements, it proves the treaty boundaries were fraudulent from the beginning. He didn't mention the surveyor's name, didn't explain why this particular revelation felt like ground opening beneath him. Instead, he carefully documented Winter Fox's testimony, thanked her for her time and memory, and excused himself from the lodge before his composure shattered completely. Outside, under sky that stretched forever, Nathaniel tried to process what he'd learned, try to fit the pieces together in a way that made sense. Dalton had been here before, had participated in theft, even if reluctantly, had lived with that for 4 decades, and now he was completing what he'd started, using rails instead of survey chains, locomotives instead of treaty documents, but the same fundamental crime, taking land from people who'd never agreed to surrender it. Did Dalton remember? Did he recognize Broken Mesa as the place where he'd first compromised his principles? Did some buried part of him feel guilt for finishing what he'd begun? Or had 40 years of justification and rationalization erased whatever conscience had made his eyes sad while giving sweets to Kiowa children? Nathaniel walked until he reached the creek, where water still ran clear despite the railroad's pollution upstream. He knelt, splashed cold water on his face, tried to wash away the vertigo of revelation. For 3 weeks, he'd been fighting an enemy he could understand: greedy industrialist, corrupt railroad, indifferent government. That was simple, clear, villain and victim, oppressor and oppressed. But this was a man who'd been complicit in the original crime, who'd carried that weight for decades, and who'd somehow arrived at a place where repeating it seemed acceptable, almost inevitable. The railroad completing the theft the survey had enabled. It was worse than pure villainy. It was the slow corruption of someone who'd once cared, who'd once argued against injustice, who'd once had sad eyes that recognized wrong even while participating in it. It was proof that good men could become destroyers, that the distance between complicity and conviction was shorter than anyone wanted to believe, that given enough time, enough justifications, enough investment in the systems you'd helped create, you could end up driving rails through the same land you'd once stolen with survey chains and legal eyes. Nathaniel stared at his reflection in the creek water, saw his own face distorted by ripples and current, wondered if he was looking at a future version of himself. A man who started with principles and ended with compromises, who thought he was different from Dalton but would discover, given enough time and pressure, that he wasn't. Was that inevitable? Was corruption just a matter of time and temptation? Or could you fight it? Maintain your principles despite every incentive to surrender them? He didn't know, but he knew one thing. Winter Fox's testimony changed the game. If Dalton had been the surveyor who'd falsified the original boundaries, then the entire legal foundation of Pacific Continental's easement was compromised. Not just the recent renegotiated treaty that probably didn't exist, but the original theft that treaty was supposedly updating. It was leverage. Real, powerful leverage that could force Dalton to negotiate, or expose him and his company to lawsuits that would cost millions. But using it meant exposing a man's 40-year-old crime, meant destroying whatever reputation Dalton had built, meant turning this fight from a dispute over current policy into a personal attack on an individual's character and history. Was that justice? Or just vengeance wearing justice's clothes? Nathaniel stood, water dripping from his hands, and made a decision. He'd ride back to the rail camp. He'd confront Dalton with what he'd learned, and he'd offer one final chance to do this right. Reroute the railroad, compensate the Kiowa fairly, and avoid the scandal that would come when newspapers learned the Pacific Continental's chief surveyor had built his career on falsified land claims. It was a gamble. Dalton might choose exposure over accommodation, might have enough political protection to weather the scandal, might simply have security kill Nathaniel before he could spread the information. But it was the right move, the moral move. Give the enemy a chance to choose honor before destroying him. Even if Nathaniel suspected, he knew how Dalton would choose. Knew that men who'd compromised once found it easier each subsequent time. Knew that the surveyor with sad eyes had died decades ago, replaced by a railroad baron who measured humanity in profit margins. Still, he had to try, had to offer the chance for redemption, even to those who'd proven they didn't deserve it, because the alternative, becoming someone who destroyed first and asked questions never, was the path Dalton had taken, and Nathaniel refused to follow him down it. Not yet. Not while he still had options. He mounted Tacitus and rode toward the rail camp, carrying leverage that felt heavy as dynamite. Behind him, the Kiowa encampment continued its rhythms, children playing, women working, men hunting, elders remembering, living as if they had a future, even though iron rails said otherwise. Ahead, the rail camp sprawled across scarred earth. Somewhere in that sea of canvas and timber, Dalton waited in his luxury car, surrounded by maps and contracts and the accumulated weight of choices that had transformed sad eyes into cold calculation. Between those two worlds, Nathaniel rode, wondering if confrontation would change anything, hoping it might, fearing it wouldn't. The sun descended toward distant mountains, painting sky in shades of fire. Shadows stretched long across desert that remembered everything, every broken promise, every stolen acre, every survey that traded truth for convenience. The land kept no secrets, only graves, and Nathaniel was riding toward another choice that would end with someone buried, hopes, principles, or lives, maybe all three. Some confrontations don't end with understanding. They end with explosions of a different kind. The kind measured in ruined reputations and destroyed futures. The kind where everyone loses something and no one walks away clean. The rail camp had changed in 3 weeks. What had been organized chaos was now fortified paranoia. Guards doubled, perimeter expanded, workers carrying rifles alongside tools. The granite-cut explosion had made Dalton cautious, turning construction into something resembling a military encampment. Nathaniel rode in at sunset, hands visible, rifles secured. 3 armed guards intercepted him before he'd cleared 50 yards, rifles pointed with intent beyond warning. "State your business, Cross." Cole Braddock appeared from behind a supply wagon, voice professional but eyes carrying a message. "You shouldn't be here. This is dangerous. Need to speak with Dalton." "He doesn't want to speak with you. Said if you showed up, I was to arrest you for sabotage and turn you over to federal marshals." "He'll want to hear what I have to say." "I doubt that." But Braddock's curiosity was evident. He waved guards back slightly. What could you possibly have that would make Dalton negotiate now? Rails advance in 3 days. Your Kiowa have until October 1st, 4 days. You've lost. "I have testimony. Historical testimony proving the original survey of this territory was fraudulent. Proves treaty boundaries were based on falsified measurements." Nathaniel paused. Testimony that names the surveyor who did the falsification. Something flickered in Braddock's expression. "You think exposing a 40-year-old crime will stop a railroad? No one cares about history. They'll care when they learn James Dalton was that surveyor. When they learn the man building this railroad participated in the original theft of land he's now stealing again." Braddock went very still. For a long moment, only wind and distant hammers broke silence. Then, quietly, "You're certain?" "I witnessed testimony from a woman who was a child when Dalton surveyed this territory. She remembers him arguing with soldiers before changing measurements. Remembers his name, appearance, details leaving no doubt." "And you came to blackmail him? Give him a choice. Reroute the railroad, compensate the Kiowa fairly, and this stays buried. Or refuse, and I take it to newspapers. Let the public decide whether a man who built his career on land fraud should be trusted with federal contracts." Braddock studied him with an unreadable expression. "Finally, you're either the bravest or stupidest man I've met. Maybe both." He turned to guards. "Lower weapons. I'll take him to Dalton." They walked through camp, past workers watching with hostile eyes. Nathaniel's sabotage campaign had made him an enemy to men who just wanted wages and survival. He didn't blame them. They were victims too, trying to live in a system treating everyone as expendable except those at the top. The luxury railcar sat where it had 3 weeks ago. Braddock climbed steps first, knocked, entered. Muffled conversation. Then Braddock emerged, face carefully neutral. "He'll see you. But Cross, be careful. He's not alone, and the men with him aren't friendly." Nathaniel entered. Dalton sat at his desk, but wasn't alone. Garrett Stone stood behind him, hand on revolver, and sitting in a leather chair was a federal marshal, badge visible, authority radiating like heat. "Mr. Cross," Dalton said pleasantly. "Braddock tells me you have information about historical land surveys. How quaint. I'm rather busy preparing to advance rails into territory that will be legally vacant in 4 days. So, if you could make this quick." "You surveyed this land 40 years ago," Nathaniel said without preamble. "Lieutenant Dalton, assigned to Territorial Survey Crew in 1845. You falsified boundary measurements under pressure from commanding officers, changed borders to give the United States more land than treaties ceded. Now you're here, building a railroad through the same territory you helped steal." The pleasant mask slipped. Dalton's face went cold and hard. "That's a serious accusation. Sounds suspiciously like slander." "It's testimony. I witnessed testimony from a Kiowa elder present during your survey. Who remembers you arguing with soldiers before changing measurements? Who can describe you? The scar on your left hand, your light hair, your sad eyes." Nathaniel leaned forward. "She remembers, Dalton. If I bring her testimony to court, to newspapers, to Congress, they'll investigate. They'll find records. They'll discover the foundation of every land claim in Broken Mesa is based on fraud you committed." Silence filled the railcar like physical pressure. Stone's hand tightened on his revolver. The marshal sat forward, suddenly interested, and Dalton looked like a man watching his past rise from graves to destroy his present. "Even if your story were true," Dalton said carefully, "it wouldn't matter. Statute of limitations on survey fraud is 20 years. Any supposed crime is beyond prosecution. But not beyond scandal. Not beyond Pacific Continental losing federal contracts when investors learn their chief surveyor built his reputation on lies. Not beyond you being destroyed in public opinion. So this is blackmail." Dalton's voice was flat. "This is justice offering a choice. Reroute the railroad. Use the northern path. Compensate the Kiowa fairly. And I bury this testimony where it'll never surface." The federal marshal spoke. "I'm curious, Mr. Cross. What makes you think Mr. Dalton has authority to make that decision? Railroad's route is determined by federal charter, approved by Congress. One man can't unilaterally change it. One man can recommend change based on new geological information, unstable terrain, ongoing sabotage, higher security costs. Pacific Continental's board will listen if their lead surveyor says northern route is more practical." Dalton laughed, bitter, humorless. "You think you've trapped me. Think you've found leverage forcing capitulation. But you've miscalculated badly, Cross." He stood, walking to the window, gazing at the rail camp. When he spoke again, his voice carried weight beyond anger, something like grief. "I was 23 when I surveyed this territory, fresh from West Point, assigned to Engineering Corps, doing objective scientific work. I believed in that mission, believed we were creating accurate maps, helping negotiate fair treaties." He turned, and Nathaniel saw in his eyes something unexpected, recognition of past choices and the poison they'd become. Then my commanding officer ordered me to move boundaries 15 miles west. Told me it was strategic necessity. Told me Indians wouldn't know the difference, and the United States needed that land for settlement. I refused. He threatened court-martial. I still refused. Dalton's hands clenched, so he had 2 men hold me while he broke 3 fingers on my right hand. Then he asked again, and I changed the survey. The confession hung like smoke. Even Stone looked shocked. The marshal's expression shifted from authoritative to deeply uncomfortable. "I told myself it was survival," Dalton continued. "Told myself I had no choice. Told myself Indians would be relocated anyway. So my compromise didn't matter. I told myself those lies for 40 years, Cross. Built a career on maps and surveys people trusted because I had a reputation for accuracy and integrity. Never mind that reputation was founded on fraud. He returned to his desk, sat heavily. Now you're here, threatening to expose that. Threatening to destroy everything I've built. And you know what? Part of me wants you to. Part of me is tired of carrying this. Tired of being the man who compromised once and never stopped. Nathaniel felt the conversation shifting in ways he didn't understand. Then make it right. Use your authority to reroute the railroad. Give the Kiowa what they deserve. I can't. Why not? Dalton looked at him with eyes holding complicated truths. Because you're not just fighting me, Cross. You're fighting my son. The world tilted. Nathaniel's breath caught. Pacific Continental isn't just any company, Dalton said quietly. It's a subsidiary of Dalton Land Development Corporation. My company, my legacy, and the person pushing hardest for this route, for maximum speed, for crushing opposition, that's my son, Marcus Dalton, currently in Washington lobbying Congress for additional railroad subsidies, who's built his entire career on aggressive expansion and dismissing indigenous claims as obstacles to progress. Dalton opened a drawer, pulled out a photograph, slid it across the desk. Nathaniel picked it up, saw a man in his late 20s, light hair, cold eyes, expression holding no doubt, no compromise, no sad recognition of costs measured in graves. I trained him to see the world as resources to be optimized, Dalton said. Taught him sentiment is weakness, that progress requires sacrifices others are too cowardly to make. I created him, Cross. Created a man with none of my doubts and all my worst instincts. Now he's more powerful than I am. If I try to reroute this railroad, he'll overrule me. He controls the board, controls investors. I'm the company founder, but he's the future. So what? Nathaniel's voice was harsh. You're saying you want to help but can't because your son won't let you? That's just another excuse, another rationalization. No, Dalton said. I'm telling you, exposing my 40-year-old crime won't stop this railroad. Marcus will weather the scandal. He'll claim I was a different man then, that he represents new leadership untainted by past mistakes. He'll use my exposure to remove me from the company entirely and push even harder. Your leverage isn't against the railroad. It's against me personally. Destroying me accomplishes nothing except satisfying your need for revenge. The terrible thing was, Nathaniel believed him. Saw in Dalton's face the exhausted resignation of someone who'd created a monster and couldn't control it. Saw the complexity he'd been trying to avoid. That this wasn't simple villain versus victim, but tragedy of choices cascading across generations, of small compromises building into irreversible momentum, of fathers creating sons better at cruelty than fathers had stomach for. Then help me anyway, Nathaniel said. Even if it costs everything. Even if your son destroys you. Do the right thing for once in 40 years. Dalton looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his desk and pulled out a document. This is the complete survey record from 1845, including my original measurements before I changed them, including notes in my own handwriting detailing the pressure I was under. It's evidence. Evidence that could invalidate every land claim in this territory. He slid it across the desk. Take it. Use it. Burn down everything I've built if that's what justice requires. Nathaniel reached for the document, then stopped. Why? Why give this to me? Because you're right. Dalton's voice was barely above whisper. Because I'm tired of being the man who chose wrong. Because maybe if I help you stop my son, it'll count for something. Maybe the last 40 years weren't entirely wasted. Mr. Dalton. Stone stepped forward, alarm evident. You can't. I just did. Dalton waved him off. Garrett, you've been loyal for 10 years. But this is between me and Cross now. Between the man I was and the man I became. Nathaniel took the document, feeling its weight. Feeling the weight of a man's confession, a father's failure, a legacy unraveling. What happens to you after this? I imagine I'll be removed from the company, investigated for fraud, possibly prosecuted despite statute of limitations if they find ways to extend charges. My reputation will be destroyed. My son will disown me, and I'll die knowing I spent most of my life on the wrong side of history. Dalton smiled bitterly, but at least I'll die knowing I tried at the end to make it right. That has to count for something. The federal marshal stood. Mr. Dalton, I need to inform you that what you've just admitted constitutes confession to federal crimes. I'm obligated to. Do what you must. Dalton interrupted. I'm done running from this. Done building empires on graves and pretending that's civilization. Nathaniel folded the document carefully, tucked it inside his coat, felt its weight against his chest like a stone, like a gravestone for a man still breathing. I'll use this well, Nathaniel said. I'll make sure it matters. I know you will. Dalton extended his hand. Nathaniel hesitated, then shook it. The grip was firm despite broken fingers, healed crooked 40 years ago, despite everything breaking now. One more thing, Dalton said as Nathaniel turned to leave. When you see my son, and you will, he's arriving tomorrow to oversee the final push. Tell him I'm sorry. Sorry I made him what he is. Sorry I taught him wrong lessons. Sorry I showed him how to be powerful instead of how to be good. Nathaniel nodded and walked out into sunset, turning the rail camp into a landscape of fire and shadow. Behind him, James Dalton sat at his desk, a man who'd finally chosen confession over comfort, redemption over reputation, truth over the empire he'd built on lies. And tomorrow his son would arrive, the man Dalton had created to be everything he'd pretended to be. Ruthless, certain, unstoppable. The real battle was just beginning, and Nathaniel had just been given ammunition that might win it, or might just destroy everyone involved, guilty and innocent alike, in pursuit of justice that arrived too late to save anyone. Some weapons cut both ways. Some confessions liberate and condemn simultaneously, and some fathers give their sons everything except the wisdom to know when to stop. Marcus Dalton arrived at the rail camp 3 days after his father's confession. Nathaniel watched from the ridge as a second luxury railcar was coupled to James Dalton's, newer, shinier, more ostentatious. The son had come to salvage what the father was destroying. The meeting happened at dawn. Nathaniel had been summoned, not requested, summoned, by a courier who made clear refusal wasn't an option. He rode into camp expecting a trap, but found something worse. Negotiation from a position of absolute power. Marcus Dalton sat in his father's chair, behind his father's desk, with his father standing silently in the corner, like a servant awaiting orders. The younger Dalton was everything his father wasn't, confident, cold, utterly certain of his righteousness. Mr. Cross, I've heard so much about you. Marcus's voice was pleasant, his smile genuine. It made him more dangerous, not less. My father tells me you have evidence of historical survey fraud. Evidence you believe gives you leverage. It's not belief. It's fact. Perhaps. But facts only matter if someone powerful cares about them. Do you know what I did yesterday? I met with 3 senators and the Secretary of the Interior. Showed them my father's confession. Explained that he was suffering from guilty conscience over decades-old events. Explained that his deteriorating mental state required him to step down from Pacific Continental leadership. Marcus leaned forward. They were very sympathetic, very understanding, and very clear that historical survey irregularities wouldn't impact current railroad operations. Nathaniel felt the trap closing. You're protecting him by destroying him. I'm protecting the company. Father is collateral damage. He understands. Don't you, Father? James Dalton said nothing. Just stood with the broken posture of a man who'd been defeated by his own creation. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus continued. The railroad advances tomorrow. The Kiowa will be relocated by federal troops. I've already secured the authorization. Your evidence of survey fraud will be buried in bureaucratic review for decades, and my father will retire quietly to avoid prosecution. He paused. Unless you accept my offer. What offer? I'll reroute the railroad. Use the northern path. Compensate the Kiowa fairly, $50,000, not $500. Give them deed to alternative land of equivalent value. Marcus smiled. All you have to do is destroy the survey evidence and sign an agreement never to speak of this matter again. It was everything Nathaniel had fought for. The Kiowa would keep their home. Justice would be served. The only cost was silence about crimes that were decades old and apparently unpunishable anyway. Why? Nathaniel asked. Why offer this now? Because public scandal is expensive. Because reform politicians are using indigenous rights as a campaign issue. Because my company's stock price is more important than one railroad route. Marcus shrugged. I'm a businessman, Cross. I measure costs versus benefits. Crushing you is possible but expensive. Buying you is cheaper. And if I refuse, then the railroad advances, the Kiowa are removed by force, and you're arrested for sabotage. I have 3 witnesses who'll testify you confessed to the granite cut explosion. You'll spend 10 years in federal prison while my rails cut through Kiowa burial grounds anyway. It was a perfect trap. Accept the deal and win everything except the satisfaction of exposing Dalton's original crime. Refuse and lose everything including freedom. Nathaniel looked at James Dalton, still standing silently in the corner. Saw in his eyes a plea. Take the deal. Save them. My redemption isn't worth their destruction. I need to consult with the Kiowa, Nathaniel said finally. This affects their future. They should decide. Marcus waved dismissively. You have until sunset. After that, the offer expires and troops move in. Gray Cloud listened to the offer in silence. The elders gathered around the council fire, faces unreadable as Nathaniel explained. Safety and compensation in exchange for silence. Justice for the living by burying crimes against the dead. White man's justice, Gray Cloud said finally. Always a trade, always a price. It's the best deal we're going to get, Nathaniel admitted. Marcus Dalton has the power to do what he promises, but it means letting his father's crimes stay hidden. Means the original theft of this land is never acknowledged. Owlwing spoke. Will our children have land? Will our dead rest undisturbed? Yes. Then the past can stay buried. The dead understand compromise. They've watched us make them for generations. Stone Deer disagreed. If we take this deal, we say theft is acceptable if the price is right. We teach our children that white men can steal, and if they're powerful enough, they never pay. The debate continued for hours. Young warriors wanted to fight, to resist, to make the railroad pay in blood. Elders wanted peace, wanted survival, wanted their grandchildren to have futures. And caught between them was Nathaniel, the white man who'd promised justice, but could only deliver compromise. Finally, Gray Cloud raised his hand for silence. We will vote. Those who want to accept the deal stand. Slowly, one by one, most of the elders stood. Then families with young children. Then even some of the young warriors, seeing the weight of numbers, seeing the reality that resistance meant death. Stone Deer remained seated. So did a handful of others. But the majority had chosen survival over justice. Had chosen to let the past stay buried if it meant the future lived. It is decided, Gray Cloud said. We take the white man's offer. We move to new land. We let the dead rest in peace, even if the truth about their theft stays silent. Nathaniel rode back to the rail camp at sunset, carrying their decision like a weight he'd never shed. Marcus Dalton received the news with satisfaction, produced contracts already prepared, demanded signatures, and the surrender of James Dalton's survey documents. Pleasure doing business with you, Cross, Marcus said, shaking his hand with grip that felt like mockery. See, everyone wins. The Kiowa get land. You get to feel righteous. I get my railroad, just on a slightly longer route. Capitalism at its finest. Nathaniel signed, handed over the documents, and watched them burn in the railcar's stove. Watched 40 years of hidden truth turn to ash. Watched justice become smoke. James Dalton watched too, tears streaming down his face. The father mourning his own irrelevance. The reformed man watching his son succeed by being everything he'd tried to stop being. "I'm sorry," James whispered as Nathaniel left. "I'm sorry I created him. Sorry I couldn't stop him. Sorry your victory tastes like defeat." "It's not defeat," Nathaniel lied. "The Kiowa are safe. That's what matters." But riding away from the rail camp, toward the Kiowa encampment where families were already preparing to move to their new land, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been lost. That justice traded for survival wasn't justice at all. That letting powerful men escape consequences because fighting them was too expensive just taught the next generation of powerful men that they could do worse. The railroad would use the northern route, would reach the silver mines 6 months later than planned, would cost Pacific Continental millions in delays and rerouting, but it would still be built, would still connect empire to resources, would still measure progress in rails laid and profits extracted. And Marcus Dalton would still be the man who'd turned his father's confession into leverage, who'd bought off resistance with compensation, who'd proven that money and power could overcome law, morality, and historical truth. Some victories felt like surrender. Some compromises felt like betrayal. And some men who started by fighting injustice ended by accepting it, because the alternative was blood no one wanted to shed. Nathaniel had saved the Kiowa, but he'd let the Daltons win. And he'd never know if that was wisdom or cowardice. Never know if there'd been a better choice he'd been too afraid to make. The sun set behind distant mountains. The Kiowa began their migration to new land, and the railroad prepared to resume its inexorable advance. Progress, they called it. Civilization. Manifest destiny. But Nathaniel knew its real name now. Knew what it cost. Knew that every rail laid and every treaty signed was built on graves of possibilities, of justice that could have been, of crimes that should have been punished, of fathers who should have done better and sons who should have been less successful at doing worse. The land remembered, even if people chose to forget. 20 years later, Nathaniel Cross stood on a bluff overlooking what had been Broken Mesa Territory. The Kiowa were long gone, relocated twice more as new resources were discovered on their permanent land. Gray Cloud was dead. Owl Wing was dead. Stone Deer was dead. Most of the families he'd fought for were scattered across reservations that had become prisons with different names. The railroad ran through the northern route, exactly as Marcus Dalton had promised. It connected silver mines to eastern markets, made fortunes for investors, proved that progress, once started, never stopped, only accelerated. James Dalton was dead too, suicide, 3 years after his forced retirement. Left a note saying he was tired of living with ghosts. The newspapers called it tragic. Nathaniel called it inevitable. Some men couldn't survive being proven right and irrelevant simultaneously. Marcus Dalton was now one of the richest men in America. His Pacific Continental Railroad had expanded across 6 territories. He was mentioned as a potential senator, a future cabinet member, a man who made things happen, who understood that sentiment was expensive and progress required hard men making hard choices. Nathaniel had never spoken publicly about the survey fraud, the confession, the deal, had kept his signed agreement, had watched justice burn in a railcar stove, and never tried to resurrect it from ash. But he'd kept one thing: a journal, a detailed record of everything that had happened. Every conversation, every choice, every compromise. Not for publication, not for revenge, just for remembering. Because if he forgot, if he let time smooth the edges and turn complexity into simple narrative, he'd become the thing he'd fought, would become someone who measured success by outcomes regardless of methods, who forgot that how you win matters as much as whether you win. He'd saved the Kiowa for 5 years, then 10, then watched them be moved again, because the land Marcus Dalton had given them turned out to have copper deposits, and copper was too valuable to leave with people who weren't going to mine it efficiently. Had it been worth it? The compromise, the silence, the acceptance of partial justice, because complete justice was impossible? Nathaniel didn't know, would never know, could only stand on this bluff, watching trains carry ore and timber and the accumulated resources of a continent towards cities where people never thought about the cost, where progress was just progress, divorced from the graves it was built on. A younger man approached, a Kiowa, maybe 25, wearing white man's clothes, but carrying himself with the proud bearing of someone who refused to be erased. He stood beside Nathaniel, looking at the rails cutting through what had been his grandparents' home. "You're Nathaniel Cross," the young man said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes, my grandmother was Owlwing. She told me about you before she died. Said you tried to save us. Said you made a deal that bought us time." He paused. "Said you carry guilt for choices that weren't wrong, just insufficient. Your grandmother was wise. She was also right." The young man pulled out a newspaper, pointed to an article. "Marcus Dalton's railroad is planning expansion through the reservation where we live now. They're using the same tactics, fake treaties, fraudulent surveys, promises of relocation and compensation. And we have no one to fight for us. No Nathaniel Cross to sabotage their rails and force negotiation." Nathaniel read the article, felt old anger stirring. "What do you want from me?" "Your journal. Grandmother said you kept records. Evidence of what really happened at Broken Mesa. Evidence of how the Daltons operate. How they've always operated. We're filing a lawsuit, challenging not just this new expansion, but the legal foundation of every land Seizure Pacific Continental has executed. Your testimony could matter, could finally expose what you agreed to keep silent." "I signed a contract. Agreed never to speak of this. Contracts signed under duress aren't enforceable, and the dead can't be harmed by truth anymore. My grandmother is gone. Chief Gray Cloud is gone. The only people you'd hurt by speaking are the Daltons, and they've spent 2 decades proving they'll just keep doing this until someone stops them." It was the choice Nathaniel had avoided for 20 years. Honor the compromise that had bought temporary peace, or break it in hope of achieving lasting justice. Stay silent and maintain his word, or speak and admit that silence had only enabled more crimes. "If I testify," Nathaniel said slowly, "Marcus Dalton will destroy me. He has resources I can't match, connections I can't counter. I'll be painted as a senile old man with grudges, trying to rewrite history. And even if we win a lawsuit, the railroad will just find new ways to do the same things." "Probably," the young man agreed. "But at least it'll be harder. At least there'll be a record. At least our children will know someone tried." Nathaniel looked at the rails one more time, at the iron path that had seemed inevitable, unstoppable, the physical manifestation of progress that crushed everything in its path. Then he looked at Owlwing's grandson, seeing in his face the generations that would come after, the people who deserved to know their history, even when that history was compromise and failure and partial victories that felt like surrender. "All right," Nathaniel said. "I'll testify. I'll give you my journal. I'll break my silence and face whatever consequences come." He smiled bitterly. "I'm old enough now that ruin doesn't frighten me. Maybe that's the only time you can afford real principles, when you have nothing left to lose." They walked together from a bluff, leaving the railroad behind, leaving the past that had never stopped bleeding into the present, heading toward testimony and trials and the slim possibility that exposing old crimes might prevent new ones. Nathaniel knew it probably wouldn't matter. Knew Marcus Dalton was too powerful, too connected, too skilled at turning accusations into opportunities. Knew the railroad would keep expanding regardless of lawsuits or testimony or historical truth. But at least he'd stop carrying silence like a wound. Stop protecting men who'd proven protection was wasted on them. Stop honoring deals with devils who'd just used that honor to sign new contracts with new victims. The land remembered. The rails remembered. And maybe, if enough people spoke the truth loudly enough, the future would remember too. Would learn that progress built on theft wasn't progress at all. Just organized atrocity with better marketing. Some fights you couldn't win, but you could choose whether to keep fighting anyway. Choose whether to let the powerful write history unchallenged. Choose whether your last act would be silence or testimony. Nathaniel Cross had stayed silent for 20 years. Now finally he'd speak. Not because it would change everything, but because silence had changed nothing. And between those two impossibilities, speaking was the only choice that let him face whatever came next: judgment, ruin, irrelevance, knowing he'd finally chosen the right kind of defeat over the wrong kind of victory. The sun descended toward mountains that had watched empires rise and fall for millennia. The railroad stretched toward horizons where new battles waited. And an old man who'd compromised once walked toward testimony that would cost him everything he'd preserved by compromising. Some truths don't set you free. They just make freedom possible for those who come after. That would have to be enough. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.